So real quick, trying to share my screen here, start the presentation. Can you give me screen sharing authority, please? Aha, there we go. All right, so funding climate action. I'll just preface this as saying that our limitation on perspective here is focusing on the state and local climate action plans of the vast majority of our member groups here. As such, funding, we come into the big question: how do you plan on paying for your climate action plan? A little context. State and local governments often start by asking the federal government to pay for things. They don't like to pay for things themselves. However, as we saw this last year, Build Back Better failed. Climate action, climate legislation at the federal level failed. We don't have the big pile of money coming. We're going to have to look elsewhere to find it if we want to do action at the scale and pace that we need. So we need to, I think, expand our imagination a little bit beyond waiting for the federal government to give us money. I will have a portion here where I talk about the money that's available, but that'll be our middle portion. But sandwiched around that are going to be some talks about public revenue on the state and local level and public debt at the state and local level. All right. So first off is the direct avenue of taxes and fees. The question I get all the time is, why can't we just charge a carbon tax through our city, through our state, and do that, and then use the money to do what we want to do on climate? And my answer to that is, that'd be great. If you think you can get a comprehensive carbon tax that accurately assesses scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, that's a great idea. But I will say that at the state and local level, you run into an important jurisdictional issue, which is that you're trying to do a catch-all policy through a limited vehicle. Without getting into giving you a degree on tax law, states and local governments have some limitations which prevent them from taxing all forms of emissions. And then in addition to that general practical concern about a carbon tax, there are some equity concerns about how it's assessed and who it's placed on. And I think it does, the idea of doing that through the tax code alone really shorts the notion of equity, of how much work it's going to be involved in rebuilding that, rebuilding communities that have been affected. So I think that that's another thing to think about. So instead of trying, unless you have the political conditions for a carbon tax, think about your traditional tax fees through a climate action lens. You have a lot of property in your jurisdiction, I'm assuming, that has a huge impact on the emissions. Think about how taxes change behaviors and change activities. Let me give you an example of the sales tax side and how you can sort of apply some equity things there. Shout out to Resilient Denver for their work here. They helped pass the City of Denver climate tax, raise $40 million a year, and has some equity-oriented provisions by exempting essential products like menstrual products. You could also think about exempting other things that would be useful on a climate behavioral level. So one other note I wanted to bring up here on just broadly on taxes is severance taxes, because that's traditionally where a lot of the state and local assessment is on extractive activity in the part there. But one problem of that is that we often take that money, you spend it directly on a program, and then when you run out of the resource, it's gone. Big problem when you're looking at oil and you want to stop drilling and you're using oil proceeds to fund programs. So a common thing that I want to bring up here, and there'll be a link with some resources to this, and that's called a sovereign wealth fund structure. So instead of paying down the revenue you get from the severance tax, you take that money, you put it in a fund, and you use the dividends from that fund, like a public employee retirement fund, and use the dividends to pay for programs and don't pay down that principal. So that's one note. Another theme I want to bring up here when you're talking about taxes and fees is messaging, which is that these aren't taxes and fees. This is public revenue. What we do through the public sector is what we do together. Climate change is one of those things that we have to solve together. I think that that basic framing is inescapable of how we get out of this. We have to give people the notion of buy-in here, that it is going to cost them something, but they're going to get something out of it. And you can help sell that with the equity informed structure. Look for the deep pockets in your community. Those are the people who have the ability to pay. That is part of climate justice, because the people with the most money tend to emit the most. Another theme is that polluters pay. The more emissions, and they overlap, right? The more wealth you have, the more emissions you have, but also sometimes you just have a polluter. You have a company, you have a very rich billionaire with some eccentric practices. Whatever it is in your communities, look for the deep pocket, look at ways to reinvest it where it is needed. The other reason to go through the public sector here through this way is democratic control. Having democratic control over your program beneficiaries and program management is essential for making sure that there's not capture, for making sure that there's follow through, and that there's accountability if things go wrong. So you'd have a public entity and public liability. So real quick here, let's have a brief time for people to post in the chat. What are some of these significant resources of public revenue for climate action that you've either found or fought for? I'm going to read a few of these here. As soon as y'all start posting them. So there's a Clean Ohio Fund, income from an electricity aggregation agreement. That's a great one. You can keep reading those as they come in. But in the interest of time, I'm going to keep plowing ahead for some of the other sections we've got here. And I'll return to some of this as we get to our Q&A at the end. So that's like a broad overview of some public revenue. Please follow up with additional questions you have about different taxation forms. Every state and local jurisdiction is different. So each one of you will have your own particular things, but it's like cooking, right? Each dish is going to be a little bit unique, but it's often a lot of the same ingredients every time. But now I want to talk a little bit about something Anna was going off about, which is the degree to which the federal government has actually given us some money to work with. It's not much. We have to be honest about the fact that the infrastructure bill was threw most of its money at highways, and those are going to increase pollution. Now they throw billions at highways. They threw millions though at some other efforts that we can take advantage of. So we can use community engagement, like Anna was describing, to divert funds away from the highways and towards alternative transportation as one option. There are some other engagement areas of various grant and related things in the bill on electric vehicles, on bike and bus networks, on rail funding, on capping abandoned oil wells, on energy efficiency, and some others. So some basic tips are actually going to reiterate some of the things Anna was saying if you want to try to access these funds. The first is tracking what's happening. There's a lot going on. There's a bunch of different grants. Each one of those grants is facilitated through either federal agencies or state agencies. It gets real complicated real fast. So one of the resources that Arda is sharing in the chat here is going to have a list of those grant opportunities. So there's 25 major ones. They're all pretty competitive. Those include things like bus facilities, charging grants. A big one right now is clean energy school buses. I also want to bring up the Reconnecting Communities funds. Even though they're investing all this on highways, they did leave some money on the table for reconnecting the communities that were divided by highways in the past. So if you feel that you live in a community where that is applicable, this is absolutely one of those things to explore applying for. Another tip is to focus on equity. The moral reason should be apparent to everyone on this call, but the strategic reasons are important too. For those few dollars that aren't allocated to highways, they generally have an equity requirement in the application. For example, Healthy Streets Program. Project applicants have to specify benefits to disadvantaged and low-income communities. Like Anna was saying, find your insider allies, rely on their guidance because this is a sophisticated set of processes and we're competing over limited resources. So you will need to get every advantage you can to have a chance at this money. I'll also just say every lesson you learn going through this process can be rinse, wash, repeated for money that your state makes available. If your state decides to go above and beyond the federal government, create its own grant opportunities, you can replicate a lot of the lessons your group learns here. Now, one final section I want to talk through a little bit here is debt. Now, this is not what I would necessarily recommend as the first option, but I would think of this as a supplemental option. Why would you resort to bonds? Well, say you can't raise enough through taxes and fees and public revenue. Bonds can raise money while maintaining public control over the nature of your project. Bonds have been used for over 100 years at least to build America in a variety of ways: roads, schools, rails, hospitals. A lot of these forms of infrastructure that have high capital costs on the front end and have an expected rate of return, cities take out bonds to fund them. And one thing I was talking about them working together, I'm going to bring up Denver. I mentioned their $40 million sales tax. That climate sales tax increased the city's bonding capacity by $1 billion. The math's a little wonky here, but essentially, if you raise public revenue for climate, you also increase the degree to which you can borrow for climate. Another example I want to bring up here is Block Power's decarbonization in Ithaca, New York. While they took out city debt that they were going to pay interest to a private equity company for, the city is bearing that debt. And the benefits of the program are going to low-income communities to do low or zero cost retrofits for the residents. So in that sense, you are getting equity in the delivery, even if the city does have to bear an interest cost. But that is, in my view, a better deal for one, decarbonizing rapidly, and two, putting the burden where it belongs on the state rather than the individual. Oops, wrong direction. That's not to say that this route doesn't carry some risks, right? Your interest rate for your bond depends upon the bond rating of your public entity, which is the guess, essentially, over the ability to pay back the bond over time. Now, if you live in a community that is heavily at risk of, say, for example, you live in an Arizona community that's looking at water restrictions on any development, you may not be able to pay back the bonds of a major infrastructure project. So that's a factor to think about. Another one is fraudulence and the risks of greenwashing that come with any sort of these financial market schemes. Now, I will say ESG stands for Environmental Sustainable Governance. There's a great deal of fraud in the space, although people are working hard to improve that. If you are putting together a project as a municipality, through a municipality though, you can mitigate against a lot of those dynamics by just putting your own conditions on what your project is. One final thought to consider here is sort of your ballot initiative versus traditional process. Bonds are complicated. Bonds tend to be fairly technical, much like grant writing. If you can work with a city, this will always be a little bit easier, but sometimes you need to circumvent the city. And if you have means to do that through an initiative or referendum process, you should consider that. And I've been saying city, municipality, but that could apply to a county, and even states take out various bonds in their own way as well. And one final note here is to build public banking institutions. So if states and local governments could bypass your Wall Street lenders to provide services, to provide interest rates and set those as themselves, that would provide a great tool. In the past, North Dakota created a public bank back in 1919, predates FDIC insurance. But this last March, Philadelphia created their first municipal public bank. Now, those two are not green particularly, but the Connecticut Bank claims to be. They say they're a green bank, as this is their definition here, is an entity that accelerates the deployment of clean energy using limited public dollars to attract private investment in clean energy products. As you can see, their leverage ratio is 741, which means that for every dollar they put in, that was $7.41 of private investment in clean energy. So it is a way to take whatever you can make in the public sector and get a little bit more out of bringing in some other folks. And with that, I'm going to just stop right there and leave the remainder of time for Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zach. We have around 8 or 9 minutes for questions, so can use up to that much time. So please, if you want to just like raise your hand if you have questions to ask.
Harmony.
It's less than a question. Well, it's more of a comment than a question. And I'm Harmony with Resilient Denver. And so thanks for the shout outs and things like that. And maybe just an opportunity to hear some lessons learned.
These garlic are so easy to make, and they're also delicious. So you want to.
Oh, sorry. And you know, what we did in Denver was awesome and very exciting. And how we did it was leveraging with bringing ballot initiatives. Nothing scares our city more than bringing one or just the threat of bringing one. And we used that leverage to create a climate office who created a task force. And the task force recommendation was to bring forward the sales tax. But it raises $40 million a year. And we know we need $200 million a year. Which is what Zach mentioned, in that we're now looking to bring a large scale bond. That said, what we learned in our lessons in 2A is that really be mindful of who gets the power over how the money is spent, as I wish we would have done that differently. And having some sort of committee or board versus right now it's the executive director of the climate office ultimately has 100%. She has an advisory board, but really doesn't have to listen to them at all. And I wish we would have done it different. Also, the other big shout out for us, like Zach mentioned, is that 50% of the funds need to go back to most impacted, directly impacted Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And I think that's huge as we look at equity going forward. And just really, really exciting I love what the previous speaker said about bold and those sort of things. So when we're going out here and going for it, really putting the leverage on and having things with teeth and going for it. So I'll stop blabbering now, but thank you.
Thank you, Harmony. Agreed. I believe it was bold, feasible, and equitable, I believe, were the three. But yes, I agree that you should definitely think about how to insulate the actual dollars to be spent properly and accountably. And each jurisdiction will have different problems with that because personnel is policy very much here. Derek.
Yeah, I kind of have, hopefully you can handle 2 quick questions. One is, how afraid should we be about municipal bonds? I'm wondering if folks are leery about taking on debt, A, and then B, have you seen any actual public banks get created in local or county governments?
For the first question, I was a little scared of bonds looking at them at first. The more I have talked to folks who actually do things like build housing or build rail, there's no way you're going to get them done without a federal government, without bonds. So that would be my, there may be like some jurisdiction that's got some billionaires and they managed to pass some wealth tax that's able to do it, but like most jurisdictions simply don't have the capital to do, to build anything near the amount of housing that we're going to need to do retrofits of every building in your jurisdiction. It's just too much capital. So bonds are a great way to do that, to insulate yourself from high interest rates and to maintain public control over the project. So I would say that they're useful. Definitely do your due diligence in seeing how good your bond rating is of your jurisdiction though. And to your second question, remind me of that one real quick again.
So the public banking, I think, is an amazing thing. And, you know, I got really into public banking through like Occupy Wall Street. And I know there were several projects to try and create one. And I know that like the city of Seattle literally approved, we will go for a public bank. And then they realized we can't implement this, at least at the size of like an 800,000 person jurisdiction. But I'm wondering if there's like smaller scale public banks or if you've actually seen that work anywhere.
You know, I think Connecticut's lending model is probably the most successful climate-oriented one. I really do think there's a lot of good lessons to be learned about North Dakota's because one of the things that they did is they brought in local community banks and made clear, like, we're not competing with you. We're not going to go for individual checking accounts. What we want to do is create a way to be free of the Wall Street and railroads mostly, who were preventing their agrarian society from moving forward. So to me, a public bank is viable, but one of the big problems is finding a political cleavage with the existing financial services industry so they don't feel threatened. If you're going all against every bank in your community, you're not going to get it done. So that would be my tip is look at that. And also look at what Philadelphia just got done. I think that's the most robust thing that's happened this century on public banking. So I'd be happy to send some additional resources on there. There's a few in the link handed out, but yeah, that's my little public banking spiel.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
I have a friend who's an investment banker, so I was actually messaging her during her presentation to see if she might have any other insights she could add. And she mentioned something called, you see, a lease revenue bond. I don't know if you can speak to that at all. She said it was kind of a sneaky back way of using property taxes to fund bonds.
What was the first word you said there? What kind of
lease revenue bond.
You know, that's so the way that the bonds work, right, is that if you have, I've been talking about this in a social housing context, for example. Okay, so say you had some complexes that the state decided to build and operate. You could take out a bond based off of that revenue that's coming in every month and use that bond to do other things. Like you could use that bond to build a new facility that you then would build up until it had revenues coming from tenants living in it, and then pay and then end that bond. So it is a way to think about making a little bit money for the state and then turning that into new money through a bond, because you can tell an investor we have a guaranteed rate of return through this process. You could do that through a lease arrangement of like residents, but you could also do it through businesses, like through corporate leases. So that's another area to explore. If folks have any additional questions, I'd be happy to dive into that world with y'all.
Thank you.